Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, we are continuing to analyze what are exactly the war goals and war aims of both sides of this conflict. The Russians have a war goal, they have a war aim, they have an end game to this conflict. Now, the question is has this war goal, has this war aim changed since the onset of the conflict? And I would have to say maybe not. Some folks would argue that the Russians had no intent of seizing control of all of the Ukraine. Well, I would disagree. And I think this conflict is giving you an example, is giving testimony on why the Russians believed they need to take control of all of the Ukraine. So if we were to pause the conflict in its current form, how would that put the Russian position on the world stage? What would happen? What would eventually happen if Russia allows the Ukraine to become a de facto part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? And look, make no mistake of it. Make no mistake. Even if they declare, the Ukrainians declare that they are not going to become part of NATO, they are a de facto part of NATO. Look at what is happening in Romania. One of the largest military bases that NATO has ever built is being built in Romania, just a few miles from the Russian border. Well, maybe not a few miles as a crow flies, but again, relatively close. And again, this is not a small base that is being built. This air base right here is going to be expanded, greatly expanded. It's basically the third of the size that it'll eventually be. So it's going to grow by about 150%, the size of this one air base. They're going to extend barracks, command headquarters, many miles around this town. Again, this is going to be the largest NATO military outpost in all of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Romania. Now, remember how I discussed going back in time to the 1980s, the late 80s, early 90s, and if anyone would have thought or had declared that Eastern Romania would become one of the largest NATO outposts, history may have changed. History would have changed undoubtedly. If we would have gone back in time to the early stages, the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, West Germany, the United Kingdom, again, a alliance that was designed to prevent the spread of communism into Western Europe, sponsored by the then very powerful Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, if we would have asked those early members of the NATO Charter, hey, what happens hypothetically, let's just say hypothetically, what happens if the Soviet Union collapses? The Soviet Union collapses and breaks apart. And then this is what it looks like. If you would have asked those original NATO members, they would have probably said, well, if that were to take place, then the whole concept, the whole idea behind the formation of this alliance would be a moot point. We would not need it. We would not need to spend the money, the resources, the treasure for the creation of this alliance. Again, the alliance was designed to prevent the spread of communism into what was then Western Europe. Now, obviously, that has changed dramatically. We have seen this alliance, this quote-unquote NATO alliance, be used against an internal problem that took place in the former Yugoslavia, Serbia. An aggressive action against Serbia because it was dealing with an insurrection of Albanian Muslims in Kosovo. It was dealing, Serbia, which was not a military threat to anybody. It was dealing with a military insurgency, an industrial grade insurgency sponsored by the West, sponsored by organizations such as USA, AID, right? That's being dismantled right now to cause conflict in other nation states. If you would have asked the original charter members of NATO, would you ever foresee a military action designed to break up Yugoslavia? They would have said hands down, no, absolutely not. That is not the purpose. That wasn't the original purpose. But obviously, mutations take place, and NATO has mutated. And Russia perceives NATO as a military threat. When you're building a monolithic military base, multiple military bases, you're putting cruise missile capacity on the borders of the Russian Federation, one may see that as a threat. Now, again, as I've talked about before, the military goals, the war aims. Again, Russia fully understands that whatever were to survive of the Ukraine, be it a rump state in the west centered around Lviv, or a nation state that still contains Kiev, that state would be and is hostile to the Russian Federation. That state would be and is sympathetic to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It would accept, under its current leadership, under Zelensky, it would accept vast amounts of NATO funding. It would become a de facto NATO client state. Ironically enough, if you go to the deep state, it would become part of the deep state. And they're not going to allow it. The Russians, are not going to allow that to happen. So I think at this point, the war goal, the war aim is the eventual capitulation of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian state based in Kiev. I don't think at this point the Russians, have a choice. Again, the Russians had to have drawn a line. Now, where that line is, most people believe it's the Ukraine. It would appear that the Russians were even okay, although they didn't like it, with Poland joining NATO, with Romania joining NATO. But the red line for Russia was the Ukraine. Now, the Russian army is greatly expanding. I talked about on the last video, the video before last, that the Russian military is expanding by roughly 25,000 to more than up to 40,000 troops per month. That the Russian goal by the end of the year of 2025 is to expand 10 to 15 more combat divisions. Now, early on in the conflict, at the start of the conflict in 2022, the Russian military was nowhere near the size that it is now. So one would have to ask, well, did the Russians underestimate the capacity of the Ukrainian military? Did they underestimate the support that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was willing to hand over to the Ukrainians? I think all of the above. I think that the initial Russian operation was based on a plan that was very optimistic. That was probably overly optimistic in terms of internal support, in terms of support that it may or may not receive from NATO, and then the capabilities of the Ukrainian military. I have to wonder that if the Russians believed that it would replicate the operation that took place in 2008 in Georgia. At the time, in 2008, prior to the Georgian invasion of Ossetia, the fault was that the Georgian military at the time was a very competent force. At the time, it was being trained directly by the United States Marine Corps. In fact, it was so confident in its operations against the Ossetians that the Georgians kept forces operating in Iraq. One of its best combat brigades was still deployed to Iraq. Now that fell apart very quickly. It was very, very clear that after a few days of fighting, the Georgian military was in no shape to engage the Russian military, and the Russians executed a very aggressive, very robust plan that could have driven all the way to Tbilisi, but they stopped, and they didn't go that far. Now, if we look at the Ukraine, did the Russians believe that the same thing would have happened? That the Ukrainian military would simply dissipate, fall apart, and the Russians would be able to enter Kiev largely unopposed, with some fighting? Possibly. But obviously that didn't happen. And here we are. Here we are. But at the end of the day, from the Russian perception, I'm not sure they can allow any form of the Ukraine to exist, especially with what's happening in Romania and then the expansion further east of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Whatever remains of the Ukraine in its current format, with a pro-NATO regime in place in Kiev, that is going to become a military base of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the Russians know this. And eventually there's going to be another conflict. There will be another war. Will it be 2 years from now? Will it be 20 years from now? It's difficult to say. But the Russians fully understand they can't be put in a position in which much of the Ukraine becomes a base for hostile military forces. Again, I've talked about this before, going back to the 1940s, What if the Germans, had been able to stage Barbarossa in western Ukraine, around Kiev? Well, obviously it would have changed the whole dynamic of the conflict. And that's what the Russians are looking at. They know eventually there is going to be another conflict. Human history is conflict. And thus, a hostile nation state in the Ukraine is simply not a viable option. Compounding that, most Ukrainians are actually Russian. They speak Russian. I mean, one would say, and I've said this before, that this color revolution that occurred with the help of USAID, now a defunct organization, instigated or tried to instigate a civil war, Russian against Russian, in the Ukraine. And I've talked about this before. If it's possible to do this in the Ukraine, in terms of what USAID and some of these other organizations, these NGO organizations did in the Ukraine, George Soros, Open Societies, if that blueprint worked inside of the Ukraine, it could also work to some effect inside of Russia proper. So again, if you have a cancer, if you have a cancerous tumor, you've got to get rid of it. You don't just leave part of it in existence, because that cancerous tumor will continue to grow. Even if you get rid of most of it, you have to get rid of all of it. And I think at this point, the Russian Federation sees whatever remains of the Ukraine that is sponsored by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in terms of how it operates. Again, this steady expansing eastward, that is a threat. And thus the threat has to be removed. So the Russian war aim right now, whether they say it, whether the Kremlin announces it or not, I think at this point is the complete capitulation and defeat of what remains of the Ukraine. I don't think it has a choice. Again, just looking at world history, what has happened, what could happen, where we're at right now, where we're heading, looking at the expansion of NATO, looking at the expansion of the NATO forces in Romania and other places as well, doesn't have a choice. So in a sense, NATO has created a self-fulfilling prophecy. A alliance that was designed to, on the surface, to prevent war, was actually an alliance that was designed to cause war. Now, it most likely was not created with that intent. Again, if we were to go back to the original founding, quote-unquote, fathers of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and we would show them the map today and ask them, is there a need for NATO? They probably would say no. Again, NATO was designed to prevent the expansion of communism into Western Europe. I got to tell you, one would almost describe some of the nation states that now exist, such as the government that controls the United Kingdom, the Germans. I would have to say they are more aligned with communism than what exists inside of the Russian Federation right now. It's like it's almost flipped. Mega states, mega control, the end of civil liberties to some extent. True civil liberties outside of sexual desire. That seems to be one area in which there are no limits to these governments in the United Kingdom, here in the United States and the West. Now, the war is going to continue. It's not going to stop, and in all likelihood, the Russians, again, the war goal, the war aim at this point has to be complete victory over the Ukrainians and the removal of the Zelensky regime. Now, I do think that the Russians see some benefit in having Zelensky in power. So right now, if they were to assassinate or kill Zelensky, would that help or would that hurt the war effort? Well, it probably would hurt the war effort for the Russians, because the Zelensky is tied to some really bad decision-making processes. And I think at this point the Russians are okay with some of these bad decision-making processes that are coming down from Zelensky, such as the Kursk incursion. This helps the Russians. Absolutely. And again, this was a Zelensky-based idea. So you remove Zelensky, there's still that regime in place. They get a more competent battlefield commander. That could be an issue. So I think at this point, that is why the Russians are allowing Zelensky to continue to exist. Obviously, it goes much deeper than Zelensky itself in terms of who controls this conflict. And one of those is being dismantled as we speak. USAID. More to come. As always, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.